This video is going to be a bit different than my usual commentary format Warframe lore video. In my video on the Devil's Triad, I promised to make a separate video on the Bibles found scattered about the desks and tables of La Cathedrale. I also made the headier promise that the information found within those passages were not only interesting, but added significant detail to the lore and world building of Warframe's universe. Well, now it's time to put that claim to the test. But first, some thanks are due. Though I did take the time to decipher the Orcish text myself, my translation did largely turn out to be identical to the translations provided by the Warframe fan forums, so I would like to thank Fallows Thorn and its Newts on the forums for doing the legwork and beating me to the punch. You've made making this video much easier for me and helped me go into this with confidence. One of the peculiarities of how the texture on the book was written is that none of the lines provide full sentences. They are jumbles of incomplete clauses, and different lines need to be referenced to put everything together. I will be using Fallows Thorn's arrangement as I think it makes more sense and flows better than my first attempt. With that said, let's get into it. Page 1. And in those days the earth was veiled in mist, and the hearts of men grew weary with the burden of their They built altars of stone and offered the fruits of their labor, yet their prayers rose no higher than For the Eternal seeketh not the scent of burnt offerings, but the fragrance of understanding. And there arose among them a wanderer, whose name was long forgotten, who spake not with many words, yet whose silence He walked amidst the desolate fields, and where his shadow fell, the barren ground gave forth green shoot. Men asked of him, saying, Tell us, O seer, where shall we find the dwelling of the Most High? And he answered, Look not unto the mountains, nor to the depths, for the dwelling of the Most High is within. Then were their eyes opened for a season, and they beheld the world as it was in the beginning, clothed in light. But when fear returned unto them, the vision was taken away, and the days of silence began. Yet it is written, Though the stars fall from their places, and the sea forget its course, the breath, for even in the darkness, the whisper endureth unseen, unbroken, awaiting the ear that remembereth to Page 2. In an age when the rivers forgot their names and the stars withheld their light, men wandered. Their tongues spake of power, yet their hearts were hollow, for they had kindled many fires. There came a whisper from the depths of the night, saying, Seek not the flame that devoureth, for within each soul burneth a spark unseen, older than the mountains, and gentler. He who tendeth this fire shall know no darkness, though the sun be hidden and the moon, that the hidden flame needeth neither oil nor altar, but feedeth upon the quiet deeds of is he who keepeth watch over it. For his days shall be woven with peace, and his sleep shall be who scorn the flame. For their work shall be chaff before the wind, and their names hath said, I dwell not in the thunders, nor in the pillars of stone, but in the soft breath. Thus it is written, When man remembereth the flame, the heavens shall open once more, and the world. And that's it. Much of the two passages are still entirely missing, but there is enough here to understand that this is not simple, flowery religious babble. I think there is intentionality here. Too many themes of Warframe's story so far are being referenced for it to be mindless babble. Let's begin with the cultural homages and inspirations that these pages are borrowing from, and see what we can learn for the lore. We know from setting and time period on the main story that dualism as a religion is largely based off of Christianity. Since its original use in the Sacrifice quest as a reference to the philosophy of Cartesian mind-body dualism, the idea of dualism as the predecessor to the Orcish religion, called the Vain Faith, has developed significantly, being discussed at length in the kinematic instant messenger and in the religious themes of the story being evoked frequently. From Jade Shadow's angelic motif with a miraculous birth, to the temple Warframe being a reference to a place of religious activity while constantly throwing out the devil horns hand sign used in rock music culture, to the Uriel Warframe being literally a devil with a proto-frame counterpart whose nickname is the Devil of Tau. Now the theme of sacrifice is being returned to the game. The first passage starts by describing a period before the onset of the dualist religion. In this time, it was apparently a common practice to burn sacrifices as a form of prayer. One of the major changes between Judaism and Christianity that developed over time was replacing practices of ritual sacrifice, such as the sacrifice of a lamb in the Passover story, in favor of the sacrament of communion, the communion being a ritual sacrifice of Jesus, modeled after the Last Supper story. I believe the burnt offerings in the Warframe text is alluding to this, but it quickly pivots to a different cultural influence when it introduces its messiah/sage figure in the next sentence. A few things stand out about this figure. First is that he was a foreigner traveling to the assumed setting of the tale. Second, that he was very gentle and soft-spoken. And third, that plants would bloom in the ground behind him as he walked. This appears to be inspired by the story of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha's birth. When Shakyamuni Buddha was born, he immediately stood and walked 7 steps, and with each step behind him, a lotus flower would grow, which calls back to the flower motifs in Warframe. I have heard some talk between what kind of flower the xenoflowers of Tao are based on. I've heard a lot of people say that they are lotus flowers, because that would make sense in terms of consistency, but to me the xenoflowers aren't really shaped like a lotus bloom. Furthermore, xenoflowers grow in sandy, rocky desert soil, whereas lotus flowers in our world bloom in ponds and swamps. Instead, I offer that xenoflowers are much more like lilies. In the Victorian language of flowers, a white lily would communicate religious purity, referencing heaven, and meaning heaven developed over time to also represent death. Either way, the flower growing in the Bible passage transitions to a speech. This speech tells the people gathered to shift their thinking about sacrifices to something more abstract or metaphorical, not trying to send the smoke of the burnt offerings literally into the sky, but to reflect on themselves by saying that the Most High is within them, which, according to dualism, is apparently the correct belief to have, because it is followed by an age of enlightenment and peace. This part of the story reminds me of either the Buddha's sermon at Deer Park or the Flower Sermon. The sermon at Deer Park being Buddha's first teaching, and the flower sermon being from the Zen or Chan Buddhist tradition, wherein enlightenment was directly passed from Siddhartha to his follower Mahakasyapa, when Buddha silently held up a white flower and smiled. Sadly, the mythic age of enlightenment was short-lived. The thing that ended it was feelings of fear. But the paragraph gives a promise of hope. The phrasing, "yet it is written," is important here. Please forgive my pronunciations, but katav in Hebrew, grapho in Greek, and maktab in Arabic are translated from different biblical sources to the English phrase, "it is written." As a phrase, it is often used to describe something destined to happen or has been prophesied in some way. And in the very last word of the penultimate line, the passage introduces the concept that will be focused on in the Warframe Bible's second passage, breath. Breath, in the biblical sense, is the soul. It is the breath of God blown into clay that created humanity. Then there is the concept of breath in the Chan Zen Buddhist influences. We may be accustomed to thinking of ki like some kind of magic power source due to pop media like Dragon Ball, but the word ki refers to breath, which then, over time, came to take on more spiritual or abstract significance, like with the concept of vital force in Taoism and Chinese folk religions. Finally, the first page ends on a phrase that would give anyone following Warframe lore a moment of pause: the whisper. We are only told 3 things about it: that it exists in the dark, that it endures, and that it waits for people to remember it and hear it. In the second page of the Warframe Bible, we are introduced to 2 opposing forces: the whisper once more, and the flame. So we should pause to review how the term the whisper has been used in Warframe's story so far. Our first introduction to it was with the tenets of Parvos Granum. Now, I am not a fan of Parvos Granum. I know there is a certain subset of the fandom that think he is some sort of secret hero who's going to turn things around for the Origin system any day now, and while I think that is naive for a major villain story arc, a point of ambiguity surrounding Parvos that I do engage with is the debate around the whisper in his tenets. Parvos claims that all of his life's principles were given to him by a whisper which spoke to him from the void, and given what we know of the man at the wall / the indifferences methodology from first-hand experience and the testimonials of Nessie Rusalka in the Along Came a Spider fragments, it is plausible that Parvos was, in fact, in contact with and manipulated by Wally as he was building out his loan shark business turned cult. We know that the whisper was a concept present in the texts of dualism. So now an equally plausible explanation exists, that Parvos was simply borrowing the religious style and rhetoric of dualism while developing his teachings and growing the cult among the corpus. Ballast did something similar with his oratory style during the Old Peace quest, and while I never miss an opportunity to knock Parvos Granum fanboys down a peg, I think there is an even more interesting question here. One with even further reaching implications. One ambiguous point of lore that is left unsettled is the nature of what Wally actually is. Is the indifference a god that has existed in the void from the beginning, whose wrath Albrecht and Trotty evoked by entering the void in his first expedition experiment? Is Wally just a conceptual embodiment born of Albrecht and Trotty's fear and self-loathing, powerful but ultimately no different than Duviri or a blast of a Warframe's magic? We were introduced to the man in the wall not as a real thing at all, but as the imaginary friend turned nightmare of our fellow Tenno, Rel. But it has grown to be far more serious and imposing than a creepy bedtime story. Well, with this Bible passage, the potential is now left open. Is the whisper in the text in fact referring to the man in the wall long before Albrecht and Trotty ever started his research into the void? Did the faithful of dualism and those that predated them simply have a more intuitive spiritual connection to the void, such that their fears and doubts would manifest the indifference to plague their minds with doubt, like the snake in the Garden of Eden? Actually, I think not. Though I introduced the concept of the whisper and the flame being opposed for the second passage, this was a bit of misdirection on my part. If we examine the text, we see that the hollow men are participating in the burning sacrifice rituals from page 1 and trying to gain power through this act. The whisper actually comes in to reassure them by telling them that there is a, once again abstracted and metaphorical, spark that creates a flame within them. That flame, a clear metaphor for faith, is there paired against more eclipse imagery when it says, though the sun be hidden and the moon blank. We covered how eclipse imagery was used in the Devil's Triad video when discussing how Father Leon Allah's character was a metaphor for religious doubt, for finding oneself at the crossroads between faith and non-belief, and how that can be a good thing, a strength as its own position rather than a weakness. Well, the dualist writings here obviously are more on the side of encouraging faith, but the faith seems in this case to be more so in oneself and one's confidence against self-doubt than in trying to elicit worship of the luminaries, essentially ending on a message of self-care and going on to say that the heavens open up for people who remember that lesson, in a sort of the meek shall inherit the earth kind of sentiment. To wrap up my thoughts on the indifference and how dualism in Warframe's setting has changed my thinking on it, where I stand right now is that the indifference existed as some kind of being of the void before any of the meddling started. Perhaps it was even a vaguely positive influence on people's lives if the dualism scripture is meant to be wholly trusted as a reliable narrator, though I think that would also defeat the purpose of the story's ambiguity and its mystery. Rather, I think Albrecht's dive into the void gave the indifference personhood and individuality, much like how the Kavya were thrust into self-realization by the indifference when they were sent into the void, paralleling the line from Fibonacci that read, "To suddenly exist is horror enough, but to suddenly exist to comprehend so much, only to be faced with extinction." Albrecht accidentally did the same thing to the indifference, gave it a body, a face, and a personality, and then maimed it by closing the portal on its finger. And because of that personhood, it was able to develop feelings of resentment and hate for the people it perceived as responsible. It's definitely not going to be a quick turnaround, but I am confident that Warframe's story is leading not to the indifference's defeat, but a peaceful resolution where they are made whole again, where we can reach a mutual understanding and perhaps even a sense of love. Hell, maybe we can even get a Kim dialogue tree with the man in the wall. That would be silly and awesome in equal measure. Well, that is all I have for you today. I hope I've also justified why this had to be a standalone video, as it would have entirely derailed the character analysis focus of the Devil's Triad video. And now that you have read the Dualist Bible passage, what are your thoughts? Is there anything you think I missed, or a different interpretation you have about how this influences the story of Warframe going forward? Let me know in the comments below. And if you liked this video, if you want to support my videos even more than you already do by being a viewer, you can think about becoming a channel member. Crewmates at any tier get essentially the same benefit of being able to join the channel's Discord server, where you can talk about Warframe lore with other fans, and read my self-indulgent anime reviews whenever I enter my anime fan moods. Thank you for watching. Take care of each other, and stay true.